This is the discussion video for the first chapter of Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. It starts off by making a concrete foundation for the contents within the book as to give the reader something to refer to as one goes along. Singer gives disclaimers for the way it is written, as he had made it more summarized and opted to use terms interchangeably for practical reasons. Then it lists the different things that ethics is not. Ethics does not revolve around sex. Despite current strides, sex is still considered taboo in many parts of the world. Many are persecuted for being immoral due to their participation that goes against the values of puritanical practitioners. This stems from long-time control of the church, especially here, as we can see it here in the Philippines. Most of the time, when religious groups call out immoral behavior among society, it seeks to demonize those that do not treat sexuality as some holy thing. This applies to deviants outside of sex, that purists condemn it for they consider them to be worldly or not godly. Even today, many of our fellow men still operate under the same values despite what it says in the book. Regardless, the book ensures to us that these moralities are not delved into as it deems it irrelevant for the case it is trying to make. Number two, ethics is not inapplicable in real life. Many that have said ethics is only good in theory are those that don't really understand the point of ethics. The assumption is that there's a certain set of rules, yet these can't be truly applied since circumstances change. This is true, however, ethics is not static. Ethical standards can change and shift according to circumstance and point of view. It is not a basic set of unbreakable rules. The point of ethics in the first place is to help us guide our decisions and make proper decisions based on the code of ethics we put into place. If it is inapplicable to real life scenarios, that means the rules are defective, which would warrant the rules change. If one strictly follows a set of rules that do not regard complexities, this would result in a much more difficult situation and might even be a lot more unethical if the typically unorthodox action isn't done. This can be avoided by not being rigid with rules that seek to aim only for good. For example, it is typically unorthodox to kill dogs. However, if the dog is now of old age and is suffering from a disease they couldn't recover from, it would be much more ethical to medically euthanize it as to relieve it from suffering any further. Number three, ethics is not dictated by what religion says is good or godly. Aside from the fact that there's multitudes of religions with different sets of morals that likely clash with each other, basing your set of ethics from what is godly becomes unreliable. In the book, it dictates that many theists state that without religion, there would be no ethics as goodness is just what God approves. This sentiment has been around for so long, Plato himself gave an explanation as to why this wouldn't be the case. According to him, if the action is good and what God approves, that must mean it is not God who is deciding that the action is good. Furthermore, if the reason it is good is because God says it is, then that means God could approve of actions that we would generally agree to be unethical, such as slavery and the abuse of minorities, which is present in the Bible. Theists then refute this by saying God would never do so since he is good, which then begs the question, who is the one declaring that God is good? This eventually leads to a circling discussion with no concrete answer that would satisfy theists. An ethics based as An ethics basis as flimsy as this would not hold, as we have discussed previously that ethics can be applied in all situations in reality. Using religion as a basis for this would cause a lot of conflicting and unclear conclusions. This isn't to say, however, that there is no ethics in religion. The concept of doing good for the sake of a greater reward is followed by many. This, however, seems flawed to others as well, as the goodness done wasn't really done for the sake of goodness. It was done for the reward. Immanuel Kant has had this same sentiment, stating that good should be done for the sake of it. It is not necessary to be religious to follow this sentiment, nor would one need to be Kantian, meaning that even without godliness or following a certain code, many are able to be what many would consider ethical. This then begs the question, where does goodness come from? Where does what many consider as ethical come from? Is it from biological evolution? Studies on other social mammals have been conducted to observe if what we perceive to be ethics is present in other species. The concept of reciprocity can be observed, where if one helps the other, they can expect help in return. We can see from this that despite many differences and nuances, there's a lot in common with all of us, social species. However, it's important to keep in mind that just because these arose naturally does not mean it's then immediately the best or the most good thing to base ethics upon. Number four, ethics reaches beyond the confines of one society, challenging absolute cultural relativity. It asserts that ethical principles possess a universal dimension, not solely bound by specific customs and values. While some actions may seem context dependent, like deeming casual sex wrong under certain circumstances due to potential harm, like a child is born but no one can take care of it, ethics itself is rooted in the concept of objective moral truths. In the 19th century, ethical relativism gained prominence, suggesting that moral judgments were products of societal norms and values. Marxists embraced this standpoint, asserting that morality hinged on the dominant economic class within a society. However, this perspective posed a significant quandary. If all morality is relative, how can one justify advocating for a specific ideology like communism over another? Marxist ideology eventually shifted from normative relativism to a descriptive claim, emphasizing that morality in a society marked by these class divisions often serves the interest of the ruling class. This transition underscores the limitations of ethical relativism and emphasizes the universal dimensions of ethics that extends beyond societal conventions.
Singer presents an opposing view to moral relativism, which was discussed previously by Avery. This perspective is called ethical relativism. It suggests that ethical principles and moral values are not universal, but are instead dependent on the specific cultural, social, and historical context of a given society. In other words, what is considered ethical in one society may not be the same for a different society. Singer labels ethical relativism as problematic because when we go by this logic, there is no collective right or wrong, and there is no way to judge between competing claims or actions. A good example of this is one's thoughts on slavery. If one society approves of this while another disapproves, it would be useless to engage in any ethical discourse because, in an ethical relativist standpoint, there is no objective basis for arguing which society's view is universally valid, since what is considered morally right or wrong is relative to the cultural and societal context in which it is situated. The concept of ethical subjectivism is also discussed. It also suggests that ethical principles and moral values are not universal, but unlike ethical relativism, wherein one's moral values are dependent on the society that they live in, ethical subjectivism's moral values are dependent on one's own preferences. Unfortunately, it also suffers the same problem as ethical relativism, which is the inability to account for ethical disagreement. When moral values are relative to one's personal opinions rather than objective facts, there is once again no point in ethical discourse as all views are valid in a subjectivist standpoint. With this in mind, Singer presents the point ethics is not merely a matter of subjective taste or opinion, which I completely agree with. In a society where ethics is reduced to a matter of personal taste, people will have differing opinions on different things. There would be no common ground for ethical discussions or the establishment of shared moral principles. Some other subjectivist theories are presented by Singer, all of which provide an alternative perspective wherein subjective moral viewpoints are dismissed as methods of ethical judgment. The first theory is called emotivism. It states that moral judgments are expressions of one's feelings. The second theory is called universal prescriptivism. This theory proposes that ethical judgments are fundamentally prescriptive in nature, meaning that they are more like commands or recommendations rather than prescriptive rather than descriptive statements. The last theory is the error theory. This theory challenges the common assumption that there are objective moral truths and suggests that our moral language and beliefs are based on a fundamental misunderstanding or error. Singer challenges these theories, saying that if viewing ethics subjectively is true, does that mean that we do not have to engage in ethical discourse, since ethics in itself is opinionated? And does it mean that any ethical standpoint is equally as good as any other ethical standpoint? Singer says no to these questions. Ultimately, these subjectivist views may be considered, but even if they are correct, it does not mean that ethical judgments can't be criticized or that we can't use reason and argument to discuss them. For practical for practical ethics to be applied in the real world, ethical facts and ethical reasoning must coexist. This way, we can have a solid basis for practical ethics, meaning that we can make good ethical decisions in our everyday lives. Peter Singer continues and presents us with the question, what is it to make a moral judgment, or to argue about an ethical issue, or to live according to ethical standards? How do moral judgments differ from other practical judgments? What is the difference between a person who lives by ethical standards and one who doesn't? Distinguishing the ethical from the non-ethical is a difficult task. Singer presents one concept which basically separates those who do right, the ethical, and those who do wrong, the non-ethical. Singer says that this method of distinguishing the ethical from the non-ethical is flawed, because those who do wrong but do not believe what they are doing to be wrong may be living according to ethical standards. They may believe that it is right to lie or cheat or steal. They are not living according to conventional ethical standards, but they may be living according to some other ethical standards. People with these unconventional ethical beliefs are still living according to ethical standards if they believe that what they are doing is right, Singer says. If someone thinks that it's okay to do something that others might consider wrong, as long as they genuinely believe that it's the right thing to do, we should acknowledge that they are acting based on their own sense of what is morally right. This brings us to more food for thought. Say that we have a man who steals groceries from a local grocery store. The man's actions can be ethically justified if their reasons for committing the act does not encompass self-interest. If the man's reason for stealing groceries is solely to deprive the kidnappee of their possessions, the man's actions are unjustifiable and deemed unethical, as opposed to someone who steals to provide for their family. Singer states that the reasoning of one's moral conduct should not only be about themselves but also for others. For a really long time, philosophers and religious leaders have talked about the idea that when it comes to being good and ethical, we should think about what's good for everyone, not just ourselves. This idea of thinking about what's good for everyone, not just yourself, has been around for a long time. Singer basically says that being a good person often means thinking about what's fair and what's good for everyone, and not just yourself. This is a universal idea in ethics.
While there are many ethical principles discussed by Singer, each with their own differences on the viewpoints of ethics, it is more important to talk about what they have in common, which is that justification of ethical principles cannot be in terms of any partial or sectional group. Ethics should be universal. This does not mean that ethical judgments must be universally applicable. However, as there are certain circumstances that necessitate you alter your judgment. What it means is that when making ethical judgments, one must go beyond your own likes and dislikes. Ethics should go beyond you and I and must apply to a universal judge. This view on ethics is something that I personally agree with. If you are not consistent with your judgment, I would not trust your view on ethics, as I can see that you are influenced by bias. Singer asks whether we can form an ethical theory from this universal aspect of the ethical principles discussed. There have been many attempts of many philosophers, and all of them failed in trying to introduce an ethical principle that everyone agrees on. There are many problems in trying to introduce a universal ethical principle if described in bare, formal terms. There are many ethical theories, some of them irreconcilable, that can meet the notion of universality. Trying to give a more robust description will also lead to biases that might end up with you leaning towards the ethical principle you favor. Singer instead proposes the following. Instead of deducing an ethical theory from the universal aspect of ethics, he states that one should start with a utilitarian position when talking about ethics. He suggests that to fulfill the goal of having ethical judgments be universal, your own preferences cannot be weighed more than the preferences of others. When you think ethically, it must extend to the preferences of others as well. Singer makes a convincing argument on the merits of utilitarianism and how it could form the basis of an ethical principle. I agree with him in that practicing utilitarianism does fulfill the need of universality in your ethics. For example, if I find a fruit tree, pre-ethical thinking might lead me to the conclusion of taking everything for myself. However, through the lens of utilitarian thinking, I must take into account the needs of others when it comes to the food. To think ethically, I must put myself in the shoes of others and think about their needs and wants. I must weigh all these preferences and take the action that maximizes the preference of everyone involved, barring any special circumstances. This is something I highly agree with and hope most people will do. There are special circumstances where there is utilitarian reason where we ought not to try and calculate the effects on everyone involved, according to Sear. This does not break utilitarian thinking, as while some ethical judgment might be obvious, such as sharing the fruits, there might be some negative effects as well, like what if sharing the food reduces the amount of food clutter? While I do not agree with the example given, I do agree with the general sentiment of not being obstinate in your view and judging everything through one lens alone. Circumstances in the real world are not perfect, and we must be equipped with the ability to critically think about our situation. The type of utilitarianism Singer discusses is called preference utilitarianism, which is different from the classical utilitarianism that other scholars have studied. Classical utilitarianism deals with taking actions that maximize happiness and pleasure, and minimizes pain and happiness, the so-called hedonism. The combination of these two principles, hedonistic utilitarianism, is contrasted by preference utilitarianism, where the preference of many is furthered by your actions. However, if you think of your achieving your preference as pleasure and the opposite as being pain, then the difference between the two types virtually disappear. Singer doesn't claim that preference utilitarianism can be deduced from the universal aspect of ethics, as doing so would be universalizing his preference. There are many other ethical ideas that can fulfill the universal aspect of ethics, such as fairness, justice, individual rights, and so on. And you could base any of your ethical principles on these ideas. However, if you take one of these views for no reason other than preference, your preference must be weighed against the preference of others equally, which you can argue returns to utilitarianism. To claim that you take the view out of more than preference needs a substantial moral argument that not many can provide. However, one argument against preference utilitarianism is the validity of whether preference should be our ultimate end goal. There are many preferences that are almost impossible to achieve, such as winning the lottery, or those that run contrary to common sense, such as wanting to kill someone. Preference utilitarians, such as Singer, counter that while it is likely that preferences are often formed under misinformation, only preferences that are made when fully informed and with a calm mind must be counted. Hedonistic utilitarians would counter that the fact that you would be willing to abandon your preference if it would not bring happiness in the end shows that it is happiness that you really care about, making you no different from a hedonistic utilitarian. These kind of arguments are discussed more in the further chapters of the book. The book in which this chapter is contained in is an attempt by Singer to indicate how a consistent preference utilitarian would deal with controversial problems and situations. According to him, preference utilitarianism is a straightforward ethical theory that requires few metaphysical suppositions. Because it is easy to define what a preference is, it is easy to be universal in the application of your ethical judgment. In this, I agree with Singer. Utilitarianism does seem to be an easy and straightforward way in passing judgment ethically. However, I cannot say if it's the correct way just yet without learning more about our other ways of ethical thinking. Thank you.